The eighth Sunday in Ordinary Time for Year C brings us to the end of our journey through the sermon, the so-called Sermon on the Plain in the Gospel of Luke chapter 6. And for this Sunday, we end with a kind of series of parables or riddles of Jesus, little short sayings of Jesus at the end of chapter 6 in Luke's Gospel. So let's begin with Luke chapter 6, verse 39 through 45. And we'll read this gospel, try to unpack it, and then look at the connections with the Old Testament, which are really important in this case. So it says this, as Jesus continues the Sermon on the Plain, after making his statements about loving enemies and not judging others and forgiving others and measuring out a good measure to others, he says this. He also told them a parable. Can a blind man lead a blind man? Will they not both fall into a pit? A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone when he was fully taught will be like his teacher. Now why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, Brother, let me take out the speck that is in your eye, when you yourself do not see the log that is in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take out the speck that is in your brother's eye. For no good tree bears bad fruit, nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit. For each tree is known by its own fruit. For figs are not gathered from thorns, nor are grapes picked from a bramble bush. The good man, out of the good treasure of his heart, produces good. And the evil man, out of his evil treasure, produces evil. For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Okay, a number of things are going on in this section. First, notice that it says there at the beginning, he also told them a parable, and then said, can a blind man lead a blind man? Will they not both fall into a pit? Now, when you and I use the word parable, we usually think of a short story. Where Jesus, like, say, the sower, the parable of the sower, or maybe the parable of the prodigal son, or the parable of the good Samaritan, where you actually have a kind of narrative story in which certain elements of the story are symbolic or figurative and represent other elements, and they become the key to kind of unlocking the mystery of the kingdom that's being taught by that parable. And that's true. That's a standard form for Jesus' parables. But it's also important to know that some of Jesus' parables aren't full-length narratives. They're more like short riddles, short questions, right? A very brief image that's meant to make you think or puzzle you, kind of get you curious about the nature of the kingdom or the nature of discipleship. And in this case, the Hebrew word for parable, mashal, in the plural mushalim, literally means parable or proverb or riddle. It can be used to refer to any of these. And in this case, Jesus is apparently offering us not an extended parable like the prodigal son or even the sower. What he's doing is he's giving us a series of parables that are basically riddles, questions, right? Using images that are figurative for spiritual truths. So in this case, he's laying out a few parables. The first one is the parable of the two blind men. And the basic upshot of this parable is simply this, that those who are spiritually blind cannot lead others. Okay? And he goes on to illustrate, well, what kind of spiritual blindness is he talking about? He means blind, not to the natural sunlight. He's not talking about natural blindness or physical blindness. He's talking about people who are blind to their own sinfulness, blind to their own weakness, blind to their own faults. And it's precisely those kind of people who tend to do what he just said in the previous verses, which is judge others, condemn others, right? Put a very harsh measure toward others, right? So the imagery here is really crucial for the spiritual life. If you read any of the mystics or any of the saints' books on the spiritual life, like St. Francis de Sales, for example, his Introduction to the Devout Life, one of the things they'll talk about early on is self-knowledge. In other words, an important part of the spiritual life is growing in self-knowledge. And growing in self-knowledge means becoming aware of your own sinfulness, ever more aware of your own sinfulness. It's one of the bizarre aspects of reading the lives of the saints, at least for me, I first started reading, like St. Teresa's story of a soul, and she's just condemning herself as a sinner, as the worst of sinners, the greatest of sinners. And you're thinking, okay, you're a 24-year-old, you're a little French girl, right, who went into the convent at 15. What could you possibly have done? How can you regard yourself as a sinner, such a great sinner? It comes off at first as a kind of false piety. It seems like that to us. But the reality is that the reason the saints regard themselves as so great as sinners is not because they're morbid, or it's not because they have bad self-esteem. It's because they spiritually aren't as blind as we are. They can see clearly the holiness of God, and the greater the light of the holiness of God becomes, the more they become aware of their own sinfulness. So they're not exaggerating, right? They're speaking the truth, but from a vantage point that most of us can't see, because most of us are blind to our own sinfulness and our own faults. So what Jesus is first saying out here is, everyone knows that if a blind person wants to reach a destination, he doesn't ask another blind person to lead him there, because they'll end up both falling into a pit. So the imagery here is he's trying to call to mind, kind of make us aware of the reality of our own spiritual blindness. You can see this, the second parable is of the disciple and the teacher. He says, look, a disciple is not above his teacher. Everyone, when he is fully taught, will be like his teacher. So he's trying to humble the disciples here and help them realize, I'm the teacher, you are the students, right? So you're not going to be above me. You're not going to be greater than me. You're not going to have greater spiritual insight than me. But over time, you will become like me, right? So there's a call to imitate Christ. And so one of the most famous works of mystical literature, Thomas à Kempis's famous book, The Imitation of Christ. Highly recommend it. Something every Christian should read. That famous title, The Imitation of Christ, flows right out of this chapter of Luke's Gospel. What Jesus is saying is, you are not just called to be a believer, right? A believer is somebody who believes in Jesus and thinks that he's the Messiah, the Son of God, which is important, it's great, it's necessary. But Jesus calls people to be disciples. And in the Greek term, in the Greek language, the word disciple is mathetes. It's from the Greek verb manthano, that means to learn. So a disciple is a learner. A disciple is a student, right? And he is student to a teacher. So Jesus presupposes, this is important, that if you're going to be a Christian, they're not called Christians yet, they will be eventually. But if you're going to be a follower of his, then you don't just have to believe in him. You have to be a student, which means you have to study. You have to study the Word of God. You have to study his teachings. And you also have to imitate him, right? Because the disciple is not above the master. The disciple is supposed to imitate the master and learn from the master, right? So the third parable here is trying to teach us, to help us learn the virtue of spiritual humility, of spiritual clarity. And he uses this fantastic, very memorable image of the old translation is the mote or the speck and the log, right? So how many people can see the specks in their neighbor's eye, but they can't see the log in their own eye? Now, if you try to depict this physically, think about this for a second. If you've ever gotten a speck out of someone else's eye, imagine if you had a log coming out of your eye and you were trying to get a speck out of the other person's. You couldn't even get close enough to them to carry it out. It's supposed to be an absurd image of one person has a giant log coming out of his eye, but he's worried about the other person who has a speck. Because that's how absurd it is when we have massive faults and massive sins, but we get bent out of shape and get worked up about, and we're busy condemning and judging and correcting other people who have minor faults, right? For their minor sins, for their specks, so to speak, spiritually. So Jesus here, and you can imagine, who's he talking to? What spiritually blind, spiritually immature people might he be teaching here? Well, he's teaching the apostles, which if you walk through the Gospels, especially Peter, for example, they're going to manifest this kind of spiritual blindness. The exhibit A is going to be Peter's denial of Christ, right? He's going to say, Lord, Even if everyone else denies you, I will never deny you, right? He is completely unaware of just how weak and cowardly he will turn out to be. Because whereas the others will scatter, which is reprehensible, Peter is going to verbally deny that he even knows Jesus 3 times. So who's got the speck and who's got the log, right? So in this context here, Jesus is inculcating in the disciples a kind of the virtue of humility, but also he's giving them a practical parabolic application of what he earlier said, judge not lest ye be judged. He's talking about condemning others when you yourself are guilty of that, which, by the way, is the thing Jesus hates the most, right? He cannot tolerate hypocrisy. That's one of his biggest. If you want to see him use his most vitriolic rhetoric, it's when he's condemning hypocrisy. And that's really what's undergirding this particular teaching here about the speck and the log. So he says, you hypocrite, right? First, take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take out the speck that is in your brother's eye. So he gives a positive point here. The first task that you should have is on eliminating your own sins, right? Overcoming your own sinfulness. Not going around judging everyone else and condemning everyone else, but focus on your own sin first. Otherwise, you risk the sin of hypocrisy. And I have to just comment here as a kind of practical application of this. One of the things you may have noticed this, you might see this before. St. Paul in one of the letters to Timothy says, don't ordain as bishop a person who's a recent convert, because he may be puffed up with pride and fall prey to the devil. So, why is St. Paul, beating up on the converts? It seems like he's picking on them, but he's not, because what he's basically manifesting there is a basic rule of spiritual life, which is that after a person has a conversion to the faith, one of the things that frequently happens is they leave behind a life of serious sin, of grave sin, right? And they turn to a life of virtue. They start trying to live a life of virtue. And when that happens, if after someone's conversion, it's very easy all of a sudden for them to see clearly all the sins of their neighbors, of people around them. And it can be real. You may have met a zealous convert before to Christianity who is really not just excited about the truth, but also really zealous to condemn the world and to condemn others and to condemn the sins, which are rightly, condemnable and wrong, and it's true. But it's animated frequently. What Paul's saying, it's a judgment that's animated not by charity, but by pride, right? Because they haven't grown in self-knowledge enough to see their own sinfulness in a clear light, which would make them be more merciful toward their neighbor. All right, so with that in mind, you got the speck and log parable. The final parable Jesus gives here is the good tree and the bad tree. So he gives this image here that a good tree does not bear bad fruit and a bad tree doesn't bear good fruit. And if you've ever raised fruit trees, you know what Jesus is talking about. I have some Satsuma trees. Unfortunately, I have 2 bad trees. I hope one of them would be good, but they're not. They're both bad, and they don't bear any fruit. And I'm about to cut them down. I'm going to give them one more year, like Jesus says in the gospel, and then they're coming down because they aren't bearing any good fruit. Now, is it their fault or mine? Who knows? But in this case, Jesus is using the image here of the fact that it's true. If you have an orchard, you'll know sometimes if you plant 12 trees, one of them will just won't bear fruit. And you might treat them all the same. You might give them all the same fertilizer. You might have the same environment, but one of them is not going to bear fruit. And you can't get the good tree to bear bad fruit, and you can't get the bad tree to bear good fruit. So this becomes an image. Obviously, the good tree represents a good man or good person, and the bad tree represents a bad person. And the fruit represents virtues and vices. Good fruit are virtues, bad fruit are vices. And so what he says here is that you will know the tree by its fruit, because the good man, essentially, out of the good treasure of his heart produces good, and the evil man out of the evil treasure produces evil. Now pause there. We've seen Jesus use the image of treasure a lot in the Gospels. build up your treasure in heaven, right? For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. So you have this image oftentimes of a treasury, right? A kind of deposit. And he uses that image for spiritual wealth, right? For spiritual merit or spiritual treasures. And what's interesting about this is that in both cases, the treasure is located in the heart, right? It's the good treasure of his heart that produces good. Now, in context here, you've probably heard people say, you'll know the tree by its fruit. What fruit specifically, though, in this version of the parable is Jesus focusing on? He's focusing it on our words, what we say. For he says at the end, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So there's a direct connection between our heart and our mouth. So the vices and the virtues in this context that Jesus is using are vicious words or virtuous words, sinning with our mouths, sinning with our tongues. In context, that makes sense because what's the whole Sermon on the Plain, the second half of it's all been about? Judging others, right? Condemning others, right? Blessing those who curse us, praying for those who persecute us. So all of those things are things that we do with the mouth. And Jesus, notice this, in the Sermon on the Plain, as he's trying to get the disciples to learn what it means to imitate him, notice he doesn't spend the whole sermon talking about the sins of the flesh. It's, not that those aren't important, but he's first talking about the sins of the tongue, right? Because it's out of the mouth that the abundance of the heart speaks. And because in the Sermon on the Mount, he's going after the human heart. He wants to transform the heart. The first thing he has to deal with is transforming our mouths, right? Transforming what we say. And I can't help but once again, just think about contemporary applications of this in light of our context today, where we have social media, which is basically a gigantic international platform where people can say things to one another, say things to people they don't know, right? Without any kind of the normal repercussions that would follow in human conversation face to face. So what happens is people say things they shouldn't say. They say things rashly. They make judgments rashly. And my own experience of this, as I've kind of entered that world and try to navigate it, is oftentimes I've been very saddened and disheartened by the kinds of things that I see Christians saying in the world of social media, right? Even people who, like Christian leaders that you might have a great respect for, when they are speaking off the cuff in this kind of social media context, reveal judgments and condemnations, which are really, at least in my opinion, seem to be at odds with the kind of reserve and discretion that Jesus is calling for in the Sermon on the Mount, not to make rash judgments, not to make condemnation. And it's disturbing because if Jesus is right, which he always is, and it's out of the abundance of the heart that the mouth speaks, then if Christians are tearing one another to pieces, right, verbally, then where are our hearts, right? Have we really been formed by Jesus' Sermon on the Plain? Are we imitating the Master here as he teaches the disciples to grow in self-knowledge of our sinfulness and not to run around taking specks out of everyone else's eyes when we still have our own logs to deal with? It's very easy to hate other people's sin with passion, right? It's much more difficult to learn to hate your own sin far more than you hate anyone else's. And that's really what Jesus is trying to teach us to do. All right, so with that in mind then, where's Jesus getting all these ideas about the heart and the mouth? Well, I mean, obviously he's the Word, so he knows them as the truth, but it is interesting that in the Catholic Old Testament, in the book of Sirach, we have similar imagery, similar parables, similar riddles, parabolic type teaching about speech and the fruits of one's mind. So in Sirach chapter 27, verse 4 through 7, we read these words. When a sieve is shaken, the refuse remains. So a man's filth remains in his thoughts. The kiln tests the potter's vessels. So the test of a man is in his reasoning. The fruit discloses the cultivation of a tree. So the expression of a thought discloses the cultivation of a man's mind. Do not praise a man before you hear him reason, for this is the test of men. Now, if you have the New American Bible, you might notice the translation's a little bit different there. That's one of the things about Sirach. There are some ambiguities with some of the language, and whether you're translating it from Hebrew or from Greek and different copies and whatnot. But in any case, let me just walk through the images real quick. First, it uses the image of a sieve and refuse, which is basically, again, you're sifting through the grain, like they have the husks and stuff like that. So when the sieve is shaken, the husks remain, and the husks are like the filth in a man's thoughts or man's minds. Right. The second image is of a kiln where you're firing a potter's vessel. In this case, the two translations are really different. The Revised Standard Version says the test of a man is his thoughts, his reasoning. But the New American Bible says the test of a man is in tribulation. In either case, the image is of someone being put to the test, right? So if you really want to know the essence of a person, you have to look at what happens after they pass through the fire. Either the test of tribulation or the test of listening to that person speak, right? The speech reveals the heart of a man. And I think if that's the correct translation, it leads directly into the next image, which is really the one that the church has chosen this for, the image of the fruit and the tree. So here, Sirach is anticipating Jesus, right, by using the image of a fruit and of a tree as a symbol or a figure for a person's words. So just like the fruit reveals the goodness of a tree, so the words reveals someone's mind, the nature of a mind. And that's great advice that he gives at the end there. Sirach is one of my favorite books in the Old Testament. It is full of fantastic advice, which is don't praise someone until you've heard him reason, until you've heard him speak at length. Just by way of a contemporary application, this makes me think about the fact that sometimes you'll see a person, whether it's a political figure or an actor or an actress or artist, whatever it might be, and you're impressed by the appearances, right? You're impressed by either their fame or by their political power or their wealth or whatever it might be. They appear one way, but then when you hear them speak, it can change the way you evaluate them. It can change what you think of them. There can be a difference between the appearance, the outward appearance, and then the inward reality. And the way that you get at the inward reality is through a person's mind and through their heart. And the way that's expressed is through their mouth, through their words, right? So don't judge someone just by appearances, but listen to what they say, and that will give you a clue as to the nature of their mind and of their heart. All right, with that in mind, then you can see the Old Testament anticipates what Jesus is saying in the New Testament. In this case, the bridge between them is Psalm 92, and it's just a beautiful psalm of praise, that it's good to give thanks to the Lord, and it's good to praise his name. Now, why would the church take that doxology and put it in the middle? Well, it's real simple. If out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks, then what happens to our hearts when we use our mouths to praise God, to praise his name, to worship him? What happens? It ends up actually working the other direction too. Not only does out of the abundance of our heart do our mouths speak, but as our mouths speak, so will our hearts be shaped. And so if a person spends their life reciting the words of the Psalms, singing praise to God in the Mass, right? What that's going to do is actually affect the way we think and the way we choose with our will. It's going to shape our hearts. So there's a motion here in the responsorial psalm that's really crucial. The church has an old saying, lex orandi, lex credendi. The law of prayer is the law of faith or the law of belief. In other words, as you worship, so will you believe. And the same thing's true of our speech, right? As we speak, so will we act. So if we put holy words of blessing and praise on our lips, it's going to help us grow in the virtue of living and like Christ and imitating God. And I think that's why that responsorial psalm is chosen for today. It's a really powerful insight. It is good to give thanks to the Lord and praise his name. not just because he deserves it, but because we need it. Finally, I'd like to close with two quotes from the living tradition of the church, two church fathers, both of them doctors of the church, Cyril of Alexandria, and then the Venerable Bede. And in Cyril of Alexandria's commentary on St. Luke, he gives an insight into that spiritual pride that we were talking about with regard to the specks and the logs. Let me read what St. Cyril of Alexandria says. Quote, "With compelling arguments, Jesus persuades us that we should not want to judge others, but should rather examine our own hearts and strive to expel the passions seated in them, asking this grace from God. He it is who heals the contrite heart and frees us from our spiritual disorders. If your own sins are greater and worse than other people's, why do you censure them, but neglect what concerns yourself? This precept then is essential for all who wish to live a holy life, and particularly for those who have undertaken the instruction of others." Cyril of Alexandria, commentary on St. Luke, number 6. So notice what Cyril says is, an essential precept for living a life of holiness is realizing that you do not censure other people before you take care of your own sins. Right? To do so is an act of spiritual hypocrisy. So the first things first, the first order of business is to work on your own growth in virtue before you run around condemning others. By contrast, or slightly differently, Venerable Bede, in his homilies on the Gospels, focuses on the image of good and bad fruit. And he says this, "Do you want to know which are the bad trees and what are the bad fruits? The Apostle Paul teaches us. Fornication, impurity, self-indulgence, idolatry, sorcery, malice, strife, jealousy, anger, quarrels, conflict, factions, envy, murder, drunkenness, carousing, and things of this sort." Galatians 5:19-20. Paul calls those the works of the flesh. Venerable Bede says these are the fruits that Jesus is talking about. He continues. He subsequently lists the fruits of a good tree. He says, quote, "The fruit, however, of the Spirit is charity, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control." Galatians 5:22-23. That's from Bede's homilies on the Gospels, 2:25. So, something to think about if you want to examine your conscience. One way to examine your conscience is using the Ten Commandments. Another way is to use St. Paul. Galatians 5, the works of the flesh and the fruits of the Spirit. What do you see in your own life? Where are there works of the flesh that need to be rooted out? And where are there fruits of the Spirit that need to be cultivated so that we can grow in virtue like Christ?